Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Get Wellbe podcast. This podcast and platform is one that I created to arm you with the knowledge and awareness you need to get and stay well naturally your whole life. Today's guest and topic is one I'm very excited to share with you. Dr. Fred Barrett is the director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins. He's a cognitive neuroscientist with training in behavioral pharmacology. Dr. Barrett has been conducting psychedelic research for mental health conditions at Johns Hopkins University for a full decade, since 2013, long before it was trendy. I invited Dr. Barrett on the show because I really wanted to understand why plants and herbs that created a psychedelic experience when ingested could be considered one of the most promising tools we have right now, or at least according to recent clinical trials, to treat severe depression and anxiety, addiction, and many other related conditions. Now, anyone who knows me and knows WellBe knows I believe most of all in root cause resolution. And certainly psychedelics aren't that. They're a medicine. You take a pill or something like it. But the tremendous promise early trials are showing and the plant-based and non-addictive nature of many forms of psychedelics has me believing there's a place for this kind of medicine for those who are having trouble understanding the root cause or causes of their mental health condition, or for those with such severe mental health conditions that doing the work to unravel those root causes isn't really possible or likely. Dr. Barrett is a wealth of knowledge. I mean, seriously, at times in this interview you might find he'll take you deep into the science of how psychedelics work and where we go from here. But don't worry, he'll take you back out again to show you the whole picture and the exciting possibilities that lie ahead with this unlikely form of medicine. Without further ado, here is Dr. Fred Barrett. Psychedelics are really interesting to me because they're medicine, right? They're not like figuring out you have a gluten sensitivity, right? But they are plant-based and natural and have had a really interesting history in the United States and across the world over the last 50, 60 years. There's been some fantastic books and documentaries and stuff recently about this change from this horrible, illegal substance to something that's so profoundly helpful for mental illness. So I have a lot of questions about it. First of all, what exactly are psychedelics in contrast to like a pharmaceutical psychiatric drug, for example, and why are they so important in the field of mental health right now?
These are great questions, and I want to preface by kind of addressing the controversy, maybe teaching the controversy rather than giving a straight answer. I've asked a number of principals at big pharmaceutical companies, what is a drug? And they say, well, I've gotten various answers. Maybe the best answer so far has been, a ligand that binds to a receptor. And they say, oh, that's interesting. Well, so are neurotransmitters drugs? Well, no, an exogenous ligand. So something that comes from outside of your body, goes into your body, and then binds to a receptor. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. But, that seems to be leaving something on the table. Why are some things called drugs while others are not? Was it a legal drug? Why are drugs legal or illegal? Why are they considered to be good or bad? One of the mentors for the research unit out of which the Psychedelics Center emerged, the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit, used to say, the poison's in the dose. I feel the word drug has gotten a bad rep. I feel that separating drugs into good and bad drugs, legal or illegal drugs or other things, brings the wrong perspective to this. And I'm not saying that you bring this perspective. I'm just trying to paint my perspective of how this all works. Many pharmaceutical drugs that have been developed for the treatment of mental health issues have come through this kind of long pipeline of chemistry and pharmacology, leading into early clinical trials that get into humans, and then eventually you find something that may or may not work well or poorly in terms of addressing a mental health problem. One of the most common drugs that we have on the market today for treating patients with depression falls in the class of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's a class of drugs that essentially binds to places in the brain that naturally regulate the normal level of serotonin that you have in your brain, with one of the theories being that people who are suffering from mood disorders, for instance, don't have enough serotonin. And maybe by just, increasing the amount of serotonin people have in their brain, you are somehow alleviating symptoms. It turns out that these drugs in some form have been around for decades. There are some people who frankly wouldn't be here if it weren't for SSRIs. And we have to acknowledge and respect that. But we also have to acknowledge and respect the fact that there are vast numbers of people for whom these drugs do not work. They do not fully and adequately relieve someone of their depressive symptoms. And right there, there's something to unpack as well. Relieving someone of symptoms of a mood disorder, for instance, or at least, reducing those symptoms of a mood disorder doesn't always treat the problem. That's not, getting to, a phrase you just used, root cause of illness and lack of flourishing and lack of well-being. Some have criticized SSRIs and other antidepressant drugs as, blunting things rather than fixing them. And having many family members who suffered from mood disorders and friends and loved ones, sometimes it just makes things dull rather than making them bright. And psychiatric drugs en masse don't necessarily address why someone may have found themselves in a depressive episode to begin with. In addition, so many typical kind of pharmaceutical solutions to mood disorders, whether or not they work fully or partially, can often come with some pretty horrid side effects. Horrid in terms of its long-term impact on the individual. A lot of weight gain or weight loss, a loss of finding pleasure in things that would normally find pleasure in, lack of libido, sleep problems, too much or not enough. And all of these things can really add up to really wear on a person in a much different fashion than their original mood disorder had worn on them. And many of these states are not things that people can sustain. So I think, we can make an argument that some good things have come out of the medical model of treating mood disorders outside of psychotherapy. But, there's an awful lot of work that still needs to be done to helping people.
And wasn't there a large meta-analysis that came out in 2022 about the lack of evidence, really, that the serotonin theory of depression really exists? Or I remember reading about it and seeing that there kind of wasn't a real case for the idea that SSRIs could boost serotonin in people because serotonin wasn't the thing that was necessarily responsible for the depression. So I thought that was fascinating and very timely with all the work that's being done in the psychedelic world.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and it's a really important paper to discuss, even if just briefly. We really don't know how most drugs work in terms of really precise mechanisms in the brain or the mind or the body. And, a lot of pharmacological medicine rests on simple outcomes research, right? Like, we give this drug to a person, what happens? We give this drug to 1,000 people, what happens? Do enough of them get better with as least amount of risk as possible? And is it as good as or better than what we have already? Those are, in really broad and kind of granular strokes, the way that the decisions are made. The FDA doesn't require that anybody really know exactly how a drug works for them to approve it. They have to know the risk-benefit ratio in comparison to standard of care, whatever that may or may not be at the time. So there's a little bit of a straw man here that's been set up by this paper. I did describe in broad strokes the serotonin hypothesis of depression. And I think what that paper was suggesting was, hey, there's no evidence that the drugs are doing what we think they're doing in that serotonin hypothesis. Maybe the serotonin hypothesis is half-baked or not baked at all. That very well could be true. We shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. That doesn't mean that SSRIs haven't helped people. It just means that, the story we all like to tell, which, I just regurgitated, frankly, may not really be the true story. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to use these drugs to try to help people. But the reasoning may be flawed, and the model, and part of what that paper kind of showed is that, really oversimplified models of how drugs work in the brain are usually not true.
Okay.
So I'll apologize for regurgitating that almost, I don't want to call it a fairy tale. I don't want to call it a myth, but that under-justified understanding of how SSRIs work in the brain. But they probably do change levels of serotonin in the brain. That might not be the only factor to having an antidepressant response to SSRIs.
Got it. All right. So in contrast to this really unknown but popular field of SSRI medication, how do psychedelics act differently on the brain? And why are we seeing more, I think we're seeing more success, right, with some of the trials that are being done?
Those are two separate questions, which I will answer separately. How psychedelics work in the brain is still an area of active research. And there are a lot of interesting ideas out there, and they may be true. I think just as much as the serotonin hypothesis of SSRIs treating depression is an oversimplified model that is certainly not the whole story. We only have tiny little bits and pieces and fragments of the story with psychedelics, but this is what we think so far. One of the hypotheses about how psychedelics work in the brain, and I want to separate this discussion into the acute effects of psychedelics in the brain, like what's happening in your brain when you're having a psychedelic experience, and then the kind of longer term effects. What happens when drug effects wear off? I like to say, when you go back to paying your taxes and getting stuck in traffic, what changes have occurred that are supporting radical behavior change and mood state change and all these other things. We know a lot more about the former than we do about the latter, but let's start with what we think we know. One of the first studies done with brain imaging in psychedelics was conducted in the 90s in Switzerland, and found that during psychedelic experiences, by and large, using drugs including mescaline, which is the psychoactive component of many species of psychoactive cacti, and psilocybin, which is the psychoactive component in over hundreds of species of psychoactive mushroom. Using these drugs, they found overall kind of a hyperfrontality, if you will, a great increase in activity of prefrontal brain regions, and also possibly, the thalamus, which is a bit of a sensory kind of way station or switchboard in the brain. And from these initial imaging studies in the 90s, people began to think, wow, this is interesting, with the history of psychedelics, like back in the 50s and 60s when psychedelics were first introduced to the clinic and the lab. A lot of the people who were studying them were psychiatrists or psychologists, and one of the first things they thought they noticed was that elements of psychedelic experience, at least in their minds, began to mimic aspects of psychosis. And so, early on, psychedelic drugs were called psychotomimetics, or drugs that mimic psychosis. And following from that tradition and that history, folks who were doing these couple initial studies in the 90s began to think, well, we see hyperfrontality in patients who experience psychosis, patients with schizophrenia or others. And we're seeing this hyperfrontality with psychedelic drugs. Well, this is all lining up quite well. The thalamus is really almost like a filter. If we were to try to attend to all of the sensory information that's bombarding us constantly throughout our lives, we'd be overwhelmed, and we never would be able to go about the world humaning, right? Like attending to things, making decisions, acting appropriately. None of that would work if we were actually trying to process everything that we're sensing, the feeling of the chair on our legs and our backside, the sound of the HVAC in the background, or that nagging itch on your knee because you have a mosquito bite, right? All of those things are going to distract you from listening to this podcast. But the thalamus helps us filter some of that stuff out so we can attend to what's important and continue to act and behave appropriately in the world. So the thought was, the prefrontal cortex provides input to the thalamus to help us decide what's important to attend to. Then the thalamus feeds the important sensory information forward so we can make decisions about it and go about our lives. And basically, psychedelics break down that filter. Whether or not they open up the thalamus or they stop the prefrontal cortex from providing that input, one or the other of those things happens that leads to kind of the cortex being overwhelmed with sensory information, which further breaks down the control, which further leads to a flood of information, and then everything follows from that. So that was one of the earlier models of what's happening in the brain when we're having a psychedelic experience. I think that model still holds water. It still could explain, taking out of the equation the word psychotomimetic. I think there are a lot of really good arguments for why psychedelics do not mimic psychosis, and there are a lot of good arguments for why other drugs could lead to much more kind of clean models of psychosis. But putting all of that aside, I think the general premise that these circuits may be disrupted in the brain really, could explain some of the acute effects of psychedelic drugs, but not all of them. More recently, there were functional MRI studies, the first one conducted at Imperial College London, that looked at blood flow and other markers of brain activity, and they found something completely different. They found, when injecting psilocybin intravenously, a really remarkable reduction in blood flow and brain activity overall, but most concentrated in regions of the brain called the default mode network. And this kind of came on the heels of a theoretical article that the first author, Robin Carhart Harris, of that initial study had published. He published a couple years before that a theoretical article suggesting that the default mode network was really the seat of the ego, the neural basis of the ego. And this seems to follow as well. I believe Robin's earlier training was in psychoanalysis. I am not enough of an expert in psychoanalysis to give, a good critique or support of that, except, my really kind of naive understanding of the ego, and if we were to try to find a brain network that was the seat of the ego, I would have guessed other things like the executive control network or attention networks in the brain, kind of networks that are involved in paying attention to stuff out there and making decisions about stuff out there, rather than the default mode network, which has been typically associated with introspection, kind of autobiographical memories, also theory of mind, my theory of your mind, each of these processes and really self-referential processing. Maybe that is the ego, but the story went that, hey, psychedelics in this case, with these data, seem to be turning down or turning off the default mode network. Maybe that's really the neural basis of what people describe as ego dissolution during psychedelic experiences, or changes in a sense of self or a perception that the self, whatever that is, goes away for a period of time. It's a compelling idea, a compelling theory that I think caught people's attention and really got people excited. Like, wow, we're really learning something now about the brain and the mind-brain connection. In the same way that I don't think the thalamus account of psychedelic experiences really describes all or even most of what happens during a psychedelic experience. I think that the default mode network theory could also have some flaws. What we've known about resting state brain networks that you can detect from MRI and other imaging methods for 30 or more years is that when people are doing stuff out there in the world, responding to stimuli out in the world, making decisions and behavioral responses out in the world, there are a series of brain networks that come online when appropriate to act in those situations. Those are called task positive networks. Networks that are on when you're on task and tasking out there. These are executive control decision-making networks, attention networks, sensory processing networks. What we've known from for decades now is that when those networks turn on, the default mode network typically turns off. And when you're not attending to stuff out there, those networks turn off and the default mode network turns on. So if you were to tell me that you have a drug that evokes this wildly exciting and compelling and atypical sensory experience with geometric overlays or kaleidoscopic imagery overlaid on your visual field, sometimes even complex imagery, a change in interoception and proprioception, the way your body feels and the way that the world seems and the way that you interact with it. And if that was coupled by, potentially alterations of cognitive processes, changing the way, the speed and the manner in which you think, and decision-making behavior. If you told me you had a drug that wildly shifted all of these processes, and you said, what do you think's happening in the brain? I'd say, well, probably all these task positive networks are turning on. And if we know anything about the brain, it's when these task positive networks turn on, the default mode networks turns off. I think it's been an interesting theory that the default mode network is really at the center of psychedelic experiences, but the very reasonable alternative hypothesis hasn't been really adequately addressed, that it's really the default mode network turning off because all of these other things are turning on strongly. And if you look at almost all of the studies that have reported a reduction in default mode network activity and connectivity acutely, if they don't selectively report only on default mode network and they report on the activity of other networks, almost all of them report greater, similar if not greater effects in other brain networks. So, the default mode network doesn't exist in isolation. All of these other things are going on. I think, a theory that I've been working on with a couple colleagues here at Hopkins and the University of Maryland comes out of work on a really kind of esoteric brain region called the claustrum. And this is claustrum, not colostrum. It's not breast milk, it's a brain region. And I sometimes get some confusion there, so I want to make that clear. But the executive summary here is that it's a brain region that's been difficult to study until recently. It's a brain region that is one of the most highly interconnected brain regions to all other brain regions. And it turns out the claustrum is only transiently active, and through research that I and others have conducted, primarily my colleague Brian Mather and he and his trainees and colleagues at the University of Maryland have demonstrated quite nicely now that The colostrum only seems to be transiently active at the transition from doing something easy to doing something difficult. And with some further research conducted in Brian's lab, specifically by Human Kadir, they've found that at this point we believe the colostrum may be responsible for essentially allowing us to switch brain network states from one state to another to respond to changing demands in the environment. I'm almost there. I'm going to bring it home now. So imagine you have a brain structure, that is responsible for taking your current brain state and pulling it apart and reconstituting it into another brain network state in order to respond to a changing demand in the environment, right? I'm sitting down, I'm typing furiously, I'm writing a paper, and then someone comes into my office and says something, and I have to stop, turn, listen. Who is this person? What the heck are they saying? And what do they want out of me? Okay, yes, I can respond to this now. That requires a radical shift in brain network states and so we believe the colostrum may be doing that. Turns out the colostrum is one of the brain regions that most highly expresses the serotonin 2A receptor, which we believe all classic psychedelic drugs bind to. And when we block activity at that receptor, it seems to block all of the classic subjective effects we associate with a psychedelic experience. So, we believe that, the 2A receptor is really responsible for mediating the psychedelic experience. And the colostrum contains a ton of 2A receptors. So if we, administer a psychedelic drug to someone, and there's a high chance that we can disrupt colostrum function and essentially take, it's almost like taking the chief of staff out of the office. And so no one knows what meeting they're supposed to show up to, when or where, or who they're meeting with, what the agenda items are. And so essentially, we found this, at least initial evidence for this. I published the first in-human study showing psychedelic effects in the colostrum. Psychedelics reduce colostrum activity. They reduce the degree to which the colostrum communicates with brain networks. So this may be the first step in a disorganization of the brain that could occur during psychedelic experiences. And this ties back to some other work published out of Imperial College London, and with their colleagues, suggesting that the organization of brain network space really changes radically. There are many more brain network states that possibly come into play during psychedelic experiences. They don't look like typical brain network states in normal waking consciousness. And more importantly, I think what may be happening here is that people report a lack of control of the experience sometimes, especially with high doses of psychedelics. And when people feel like they should have some control but can't exert that control over their thought processes, that's when a lot of people can begin to struggle with psychedelic experiences. But I think this is all speaking to potential effects of psychedelics and disrupting our ability to maintain and control our brain network state space, which then leads to all of the other things. But what does any of this mean? Why is any of this important? It sounds like some interesting and esoteric, nerdy stuff that you're saying, Dr. Barrett, but why do any of us care, and why is any of this important? Well, here's where I think it really gets interesting. Some of our behavioral evidence and evidence from careful testing and questionnaires and qualitative investigation of people's experiences when they've been administered these drugs, both healthy people and patients being studied to see if we can treat mental health issues with these drugs. People often report encountering some often unexpected, deeply personally meaningful psychological insight that they've encountered during this experience that then kind of feeds their healing process, whatever that ends up being. Even healthy individuals, who undergo these experiences, can find an increase in well-being and life satisfaction and relief from anxiety or other mood states that are kind of wearing on them. Thinking of moving in the direction of increased flourishing. It may be that these psychological insights are what's driving at least the storytelling about healing and well-being that follows these experiences. And it could be that in this chaotic brain state where we don't have the control over our mindset that we're used to, that previously learned maladaptive mental behaviors that keep us in a rut of negative rumination, or that drive us to making certain assumptions rather than others about our relationships or our place in the world, that these for a short period of time don't have control over us anymore, and that allows us to kind of really entertain other ideas about how all of this should work, or who we are, or what that means. And it's so this kind of feeds into a theory that Robin Carhart-Harris has focused on, which is the entropic brain, or relaxation of beliefs under psychedelics. It's possible that some form of relaxation of our prior beliefs leads us to a state in which we can entertain new beliefs that then kind of take hold and have purchase in our minds. I think how that works long term, there are two stories that I want to weave into this now that I think explain this. One is with meta control and the learned value of control. So this is I'll give a shameless plug for a paper that my postdoctoral fellow Jada Sayala and I just published in Neuron at the beginning of the year, the journal Neuron. Essentially, the meta control describes a process by which we adaptively shift between cognitive flexibility and cognitive stability in our lives, and in responding to things that we need to do in the environment. You can imagine a lot of situations in which you need stability, sitting down to write a paper or read a book. You need cognitive stability. You need to be stable in one cognitive state to have sustained attention addressing a task, right? And there are other situations in which you need a lot of cognitive flexibility, like driving through hectic traffic, right? You need to be able to respond flexibly to really rapidly changing and unexpected things in the environment. And really, meta control is the process by which we manage that shift between flexibility and stability. And patients who are suffering from depression or substance use disorders, they can be described in part as suffering possibly from a lack of meta control, or a maladaptive application of meta control, where mostly people are find themselves in a maladaptive state of stability over flexibility, right? And this can be described behaviorally in terms of compulsive drug seeking in patients who are suffering from substance use disorders, or stuck in loops of negative rumination in patients who are suffering from mood disorders, right? And the theory that Jada kind of lays out is essentially that we, by having these experiences that throw us into a radically flexible state during a psychedelic experience, that on a molecular or a neural or even a psychological level, we begin to relearn the value of flexibility. And you can think of coming from a deeply stable, maladaptively stable state to a short period of possibly radical flexibility that then levels off in the middle. And then going forward, after these experiences, people are able to exert a greater amount of flexibility, or at least shifting more adaptively between flexibility and stability where they weren't able to do so before. And we've shown some brief evidence for this, possibly in our patients treated for major depressive disorder. We've shown careful behavioral evidence that these patients, after treatment with psilocybin, have a notable increase in the capacity for cognitive flexibility, the capacity for thinking more adaptively, or changing the way you think about yourself or your place in the world, or decision making capacity. And so we have behavioral evidence for this. We have some evidence in brain imaging studies that we've conducted in the same patients. To begin to answer your second question, which is like vaguely, why are we excited about these drugs? What are they doing to help people? We're finding, outside of all of this kind of esoteric neuroscience and cognitive psychology, at the end of the day, when these compounds are administered to properly screened individuals in an environment in which they feel safe, they've been prepared as much as possible for the experience, and they're having these experiences in the presence of two trained therapists with whom they've built trust and rapport. And those are therapists that are going to work with the participant afterwards to help integrate the experience into their lives and help them move forward. Under these conditions, we're seeing some really remarkable effect sizes in treating patients, at least with mood disorders, patients with substance use disorders. And now there are a wide range of studies that are being conducted in a greater number of indications. Here at Hopkins, we're conducting studies in patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, Alzheimer's dementia, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. I'm conducting a large clinical trial in patients with depression and co-occurring alcohol use disorder, which is more the rule rather than the exception out in the world with people who are suffering from either. They're often suffering also from a small or large piece of the other.
We'll be right back with Dr. Fred Barrett after this quick message. I don't know about you, but I never listen to the end of a podcast, so I'm hopping in here to let you know that the best way to stay empowered and on top of your health is to be in the WellBe community. So head to getwellbe.com/subscribe to make sure you're in like Flynn. On getwellbe.com, you'll learn about my online programs to help you go deeper and make life-altering changes to your health, and our awesome non-toxic product database. If you're more of a social media person, let's be friends on Instagram. Find me at getwellbe. Okay, now back to my interview with Dr. Fred Barrett. Lyme is an important topic to me, and I know Dr. John Alcott and his work at Hopkins pretty well. So I'm curious about that because he and I talk quite a bit about, post-treatment or chronic Lyme and how he's one of the few in the medical establishment who's saying the medical establishment has it wrong. So I'm curious how the psychedelics are playing into that.
Yeah, great question. And so, there are a couple angles here, and the studies being, the principal investigators on that are Dr. Albert Garcia Ramu and Dr. John Alcott. And so the Psychedelic Research Center is collaborating with the Lyme Research Center here at Hopkins to conduct this study. The jury is still out. We're in the middle, really directly in the middle of subject recruitment. I think we've recruited half of the intended sample, and no analyses have been conducted yet. So I can't say anything definitive, and I wouldn't want to preempt Al or John in kind of reporting any of that. But suffice to say, some of the rationale was and still is treating some of the existential crisis that occurs, secondary to, or not quite an existential crisis in the same way as with a late stage cancer diagnosis, but the struggle and the depression and the affective components and of kind of living with post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. That's been an initial target of this study, and acknowledging also the growing literature suggesting at least peripheral potential for anti-inflammatory effects of psychedelic drugs. What are the potential overlaps here? Are there other kind of non-psychiatric biological mechanisms by which psychedelics could affect patients with post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome? I'm not sure I can say any more than that, except that we're really excited about the study and really excited to see where it goes.
That's great. Because I don't know anybody that's gone through a chronic or a post-treatment Lyme battle that isn't kind of made depressed by it, because it goes on for so long and it's very hopeless.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. So if there's some way to, use the brain rewiring or whatever our, understanding of the psychedelic effect on it to at least get your brain on your team to try to help with overcoming and doing the work that it takes to get over post-treatment Lyme, which is a lot of not strict lifestyle regimen, but you really have to take care of yourself for a very long period of time in order to see improvement. And I think when you get depressed, it's hard to do that. So yeah, that's fascinating to me. So I just want to back up for a second and say, how did you get into this area? Obviously you went through training that didn't have to do with psychedelics, and then you ended up here, but what drew you to it?
Yeah, I like to tell people that I got into this by accident. I had initially studied in grad school the cognitive neuroscience of music perception and cognition. Overall, what drew me to this field and in this research and what fueled my interest in it was a deep and profound excitement and interest in understanding states of consciousness. I had a bit of a meditation practice, somewhat non-traditional meditation practice for periods of my life. I had also been a professional musician for periods of my life, and playing on stage at a professional level with a good group of musicians can lead to some rather profound altered states of consciousness, some of which include and mimic kind of like a flow state, or being in the groove, or a really a no self type of situation, but yet still deeply emotionally kind of laden, and meditation states and dabbling with kind of those type of practices can lead you to other altered states of consciousness. I also studied Aikido for a number of years, and the act of art of practicing Aikido can lead to altered states of consciousness, and really, always having a kind of fundamental fascination with these states drew me initially kind of to studying music and trying to understand the powerful impact that music listening can have on us. People every day use music to kind of help them regulate their emotions, and even without playing an instrument or being on stage. I hope it's not a lost art. People can still resonate with it, but the practice of deep listening, like, closing the door, turning off the lights, lowering the blinds and closing your eyes and just like listening to a record from start to finish and doing nothing but completely focusing on that record and what it brings up on you. There's so many different kind of practices here that can change our minds in subtle ways. I was initially motivated to get into cognitive neuroscience by the hope or the kind of potential of using music as a tool to study the mind and the brain, and that's what I got into in grad school. But the music is just one tool. MRIs and EEG systems, they're just tools, and psychedelics are just, on one hand they're just another tool, and on the other hand they're a very, very powerful tool, right?
Do you think the fact that psychedelics come from, not to get hippy dippy, but come from the earth, right? And we come from the earth, that there's a connection there that makes it more effective than using a, human created chemical substance on the brain? Do you think there's something there about that makes it more like meets like they recognize each other better? I'll take it back to Lyme. Dr. Alcott's research and a lot of what Hopkins has seen shows herbs are so incredibly impactful for Lyme, in a way that other things kind of haven't been able to be. They just take longer to work. I wonder if it's that kind of thing where it's like the medicine is so designed for other animals or other things created from the earth that it pairs up without as much risk. But of course, you can tell me if there is as much risk. It seems like the benefit risk ratio is higher.
Compared to what?
Than a psychiatric drug, for example.
Yeah, I think there's room for that discussion. A parallel example here is, cannabis is federally illegal in the United States and most countries. And for a period of time, from what I understand, black market availability of chemicals began to include synthetic cannabinoids. These were compounds that were, similar to, for instance, THC, but not exactly similar. And by the kind of vagaries of scheduling law, had not yet been scheduled, and so technically weren't really illegal to sell or buy or use until the DEA found them and then scheduled them, and then the chemists would go to the next iteration of that compound and like slightly tweak something in the chemical structure, so they made a new compound that yet wasn't scheduled. And the synthetic cannabinoids evolved into compounds that could still get people high but became incredibly dangerous and cause heart attacks and psychosis and all these other things. And it got to the point where people were starting to worry, oh my God, all these synthetic cannabinoids, the terrible plague on people who are using them. It's too bad we don't have a natural alternative that's safe. Relatively speaking, yes, cannabis is incredibly safe compared to some of these synthetic cannabinoids, right? And I think there's room to be open to some kind of natural biological synergy between mushrooms and that are psychoactive and our brains. I have trouble fully accepting an argument or a story that involves some kind of like intelligent design involved in this. But another way to pose the question is, well, why did God or the universe or the great electron in the sky or whatever it is, or evolution, create so many ways for us to hallucinate? Why are there so many natural sources, plant sources, fungal sources, and other sources? Why are there so many sources of compounds that lead us to not hallucinate, but have a psychedelic experience?
So I've had some family members and friends use ketamine with a psychiatrist and in a controlled environment. And it seems like a lot of people talk to me about using ketamine and whether they should and what they're thinking about. And as far as I understand it, ketamine is not a natural substance the way that a mushroom is. It doesn't come necessarily from the earth. I believe it was created in the 1980s as a horse tranquilizer. But you could tell me more. How does ketamine differ from, these other forms of psychedelics that you're studying that are more plant-based? And are you seeing the same results as far as, benefit risk ratio and effectiveness and all that?
Yeah, so yeah, ketamine, I don't believe has natural sources, but it also kind of begs the question of what's a psychedelic, right? And this is currently an ongoing debate in the field. The
Right,
word
like
psychedelic,
a something that makes you hallucinate versus something that was created that is like plant-based. I'm saying there's a difference between anything that makes you hallucinate and something that's plant-based and makes you hallucinate. But you're right, there's a lot of debate about what that is.
psilocybin, the typical psychedelic approach to therapy here involves giving someone a massive dose of psilocybin or LSD or something similar, and leading them to a radically altered state of consciousness, during which protocolized therapy typically does not occur. Therapy occurs before and after, but it's really kind of putting someone into this space, letting them work it out themselves, and then we do aftercare. Whereas MDMA therapy, there's psychotherapy that occurs before and after the experimental drug sessions, but there's also therapy that occurs, talk therapy that reliably occurs during the drug session, and that's primarily where a lot of the work is supposed to end up, beginning, if not occurring. So those are differences between the therapeutic approaches and the therapeutic models of these drugs, at least at a high kind of rough level. But the interesting thing between MDMA and psilocybin is that the durability of effects seems to be itself incredibly remarkable. This is almost certain to differ between indications. In our waitlist control trial in patients with major depressive disorder, we observed half of the patients were in remission from depression for at least a year after 2 separate administrations of psilocybin. It sounds like with the MDMA and treatment of PTSD that patients, I don't want to use the C word, but I think other people are using the C word, like cure people of their PTSD or give them at least incredibly durable, long-lasting relief from their PTSD symptoms. Ketamine is completely different. It's a different drug. It acts in different receptors in the brain. It acts in NMDA receptor antagonist, and which may lead to increased glutamate levels. There are some that argue that despite differing apparent initial sites of pharmacological action of these drugs, despite binding to different receptors, these drugs all lead to the same downstream effects. There's some like second messenger signaling that occurs in the brain that leads to an upregulation of this and a downregulation of this, and they eventually all lead to the same place. I'm not sure that we fully can support that yet with evidence, but suffice to say, ketamine, as administered in ketamine clinics now around the country, maybe around the world, is administered intravenously or intranasally, leads to an almost immediate antidepressant effect that lasts for like a week or two, depending on who you ask or what paper you read. But there's, at least not systematically any talk therapy that accompanies this. There's no special treatment of the space and the state that people are in when they have this experience or when they receive this treatment. There's no preparation. There's no real integration in the same way that classic psychedelic therapy occurs. And people have to come for repeat doses every week or 2 or 4, and it becomes this chronic thing that may over time may reduce an efficacy for a given person. And open questions include, but are not limited to, what would happen with ketamine if we did package it in the same kind of procedures that we do psilocybin and MDMA administration? Could we get longer lasting effects? Unknown. Some people are trying this. It's not clear that there's a real good signal there yet. But they all make you feel different than you feel right now, right?
Right.
So if that's the definition of psychedelic, then yeah, sure, they're all psychedelics. But my really unfair kind of straw man argument here is that the caffeine that I drank this morning has mind manifesting effects and changed the way
I know.
that
Well, then we could say alcohol too, right?
Absolutely. So where do we draw the line, right?
Yeah. So with ketamine, do you think that the popularity of its use right now is more so regulatory? It's just easier to get your hands on because of the federal laws around psilocybin?
It is a scheduled drug, but it's available in the pharmacy. Doctors can prescribe it. Everybody that's using it right now, unless they're using the kind of the FDA approved intranasal version, they're prescribing it off label, but they can do that as physicians. And yeah, I think access is part of the proliferation here, but also because it does have such immediate effects in the people that it works for, right? People go, they're like, oh wow, this worked. And instead of taking a pill every day that's going to have all of these side effects that may or may not work, and it'll take me 6 weeks to determine whether it'll do anything, going once every couple of weeks to my clinic to get a shot is easy, right?
But do you find that most of the trials you've done with psilocybin, there's an immediate effect as well?
Well, for a lot of people, it seems to be the case. Yeah. So, but it just so happens that psilocybin is not approved as a medicine and can't be prescribed in a clinic, right? So that's,
Right.
I mean, that if you're looking for an answer as to why people are accessing ketamine and not psilocybin, it's because they can access ketamine and they can't
Yeah.
access psilocybin except for clinical trials, right?
Right. Yeah, that's the conclusion I kind of came to, and so many people were being
Mhm.
advised to use it, but I was thinking it's also just because they couldn't get it. It's like, um, so with all of that in mind, who are the people that you think really should be using psychedelics? And we can talk about the differences between them for another hour, but just generally, and the people who really shouldn't be using them.
Well, so far, no classic psychedelics have been approved as medicines, so they're not available in the clinic yet. My expectation is that, once we get enough data, once the phase 3 clinical trials are approved, that my expectation and the expectation of many is that it's possible the FDA may approve psilocybin for the treatment of major depressive disorder. At that point, it's likely that people will begin to set up clinics to offer psilocybin therapy for patients with depression. One of the interesting things about all of this is that we don't know really what the limits to the indication space are. All these studies that I rattled off that just at Hopkins, not let alone other centers in the country and the world, people are almost throwing it at the wall for everything. I fear that it's going to be seen as a panacea and be treated as a panacea, and I absolutely don't believe it is a panacea, or we should expect it to be a panacea, and I think we should be worried and skeptical about that. But I do think there's a great potential for treatment of mood and substance use disorders, at the very least, with psilocybin. One of the things that seems to be more and more apparent is a potential risk for patients who have a personal or family history of psychosis. And so this is something we were theoretically worried about, but there are a couple of case reports out now, and kind of fits the pharmacology that especially patients who may be prone to experiencing mania or having manic episodes, it may be quite a profound risk for these individuals. And some of that evidence comes from case reports that have been recently published in literature. Other evidence for that comes anecdotally through personal reports online and to myself and others, but also the kind of pharmacology of this thing. It's been known for some time that patients with bipolar 1 disorder, patients with bipolar, they can experience mania. They may be at risk for having a manic episode or precipitating a manic episode if they're administered serotonergic antidepressants like SSRIs. And so it's even more of a struggle to treat patients with bipolar disorder, because not only can it be a really kind of pernicious and chronic illness, but you can't leverage the first line therapy for unipolar depression. In the same way, it really feels like people try not to tap on the serotonin system when treating patients with bipolar disorder. Why should we go in with a heavily serotonergic drug like psilocybin or LSD to treat patients with bipolar disorder? Also, the history of thinking about these drugs as psychotomimetics. I said, they don't seem to me to be good models for psychosis, but there's enough overlap, or at least, even the hint of similarity of the experience to psychosis makes you wonder whether it's a safe and a reasonable thing to try to administer these compounds to people who are at risk for psychosis. That seems to be like one of the biggest signals for risk here that we can understand, at least in the psychiatric realm.
Yeah. My mother, she had bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder and mania and stuff. So this is all very
close to my heart. But what I saw from her experience in the last couple of years of her life were just she was so debilitated by the pharmaceuticals that were offered. It was really, like you described it, such a dulling, rather than, there was just nothing left on earth to feel, even though it took away mania. So I'm always hopeful that for these major psychiatric illnesses, not that anxiety and depression aren't, but there are more varying degrees of it in society versus like if you have mania, that there's some more humane treatment that comes along, because the pharmaceutical approach, I just found that the risk benefit was not strong. It was or rather the quality of life it produced was the same misery in a different capacity. But anyway, so on that topic, I mean, there are many different pharmaceutical drugs for many different kinds of mental illnesses, both acute and long-term. But do you think, I mean, using your visionary mind, that 50 years from now, psychedelic medicine will eventually replace pharmaceutical drugs as the go-to treatment for some or all mental health disorders? And, why or why not?
I think it's possible that there's a future in which that could be the case. Some of the challenges that people are rightfully kind of worrying about in the approval of these drugs is scalability, right? Currently within the current models, we require at least one, if not two, licensed mental health practitioners to be in the room for 8 hours when people are having a psilocybin experience. If we were talking about LSD, that would be 12 to 16 hours. We need, adequate screening and intense psychotherapy that occurs before and afterwards. And so, all of that adds up. We still don't know truly if people can be treated while maintained on antidepressants like SSRIs. Weaning people off of SSRIs, even if you think they're not working at the moment, could be a risk. Sometimes people are taking SSRIs, they don't feel they're fully working. They may not be fully working, but they may be doing something. And even if they're not doing enough, taking you back off of those SSRIs could put you in a worse state than where you were. And so, and there's thought that, especially for certain drugs, taking you off of that SSRI and then putting you back on it at a later state, that drug may not work even as poorly as it did before. It may not work as effectively. And so there are a lot of risks that really need to be, weighed here, when we're talking about treating real people and impacting their lives. And a lot of these questions haven't been answered. But assuming we can find some kind of drug, treatment, we can treat people that are maintained on SSRIs, for instance, in the future. And assuming that insurance companies agree to come behind and reimburse some, if not all of this, then, there are some reasonable arguments here. If it all comes down to durability of effects, if the effects that we found in our clinical trial and our waitlist control trial of 50% remission from depression for at least a year after treatment, if that's real, if that sustains kind of scrutiny and interrogation, and that's predictive of how this will work in the real world, then gosh, 16 hours of therapy or 20 hours of therapy, the cost of that pales in comparison to the lifetime cost to the individual and society for someone suffering from depression, right?
And think about, just how much talk therapy costs, hours and hours and hours of it, versus something that might bypass or be the equivalent of 3 years of talk therapy in a single session. The savings could be there, even if, two people are required in the room and this or that,
Exactly. And if you can prove those numbers to insurance companies, I hear that that's the kind of stuff they respond to, but there's a lot of other exciting stuff going on too. People are looking into shorter acting psychedelics, such as DMT. There have been, over the past month or two studies that show that an intravenous infusion of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, can allow you to really carefully control the depth and length of a psychedelic experience. Imagine being able to use a DMT infusion to get someone into a psychedelic experience for an hour and a half, and imagine that that's enough to have the full therapeutic response, and you can control that really precisely. So instead of having someone in for 8 hours for a psilocybin session, you bring them in for 2 hours to have an hour and a half long DMT session, and that makes things a whole lot more cost effective. There are other people who are looking into psychedelic analogs that are not psychedelic. These are, taking the trip out of the treatment. I'll go on record by saying I believe the trip is part of the treatment, and I don't think these drugs will work in the same way that the classic psychedelics currently work. But, the argument that was returned to me at a conference recently, which I have to agree with, is that, yeah, fine, if the trip is necessary for the full treatment effect, that's great. But there are plenty of people who we probably won't be able to administer these drugs to, people with psychosis, people who have really high blood pressure that's uncontrolled, other, who knows what other populations will come to find are really more of a risk than we understood. Don't those people deserve some chance as well? Of course they do. And I think they're trying to engineer the new generation of chronic antidepressant drugs. You may take a drug that was derived from psilocybin, but is not psilocybin. And if you take that pill daily or every other day or every 3 days, and if you get 50% better than you were before, hey, that's valuable too. I think all of these things are on the table. They could all be entertained. I'll believe it when I see it, frankly, but I would love to be proven wrong on that. But backing up for a second as well, within all of this hype, we still have to acknowledge that there's still so little known. That waitlist control trial that I keep referring to that we conducted was in all of 24 patients. Up until recently, the largest clinical trial had been in 50 people. And there was a recent phase 2B clinical trial published by Compass Pathways that had treated 233 people with treatment-resistant depression. That had absolutely been the largest modern study to date with the psychedelic for treating an indication. And up until that point, there had been on the order of hundreds of people in the entire literature, modern literature, that had been treated for any indication whatsoever in a randomized controlled trial that was peer-reviewed and published. So the number of people in the world that have been treated with psychedelics in a randomized controlled trial is still minuscule compared to what we usually expect in terms of generating an evidence base to approve something as a medicine. And there's still a million questions we haven't answered. So we're still early on in this, but I think we can still be excited because the effects are so large so far. We just have to temper that by understanding that, we're not there yet. And in that large clinical trial in 233 people, it was for treatment-resistant depression, which are patients who are more acutely ill and more chronically ill than patients with major depressive disorder writ large. By definition, they're more difficult to treat. They may be more intractable. The therapeutic effects in that published study were not as remarkable as everybody expected. And in the high-dose treatment group, there were 5, I think, severe adverse effects. I don't think there were serious adverse effects, and there's a difference there, right? It was just a very severe, but not, it's unclear. We have to go back to the paper and read it again to make sure. But adverse effects that we hadn't expected as a field and hadn't really seen quite yet in our clinical trials. And so it may be the case that patients with treatment-resistant depression aren't going to respond as well to this because they don't respond as well to anything, or they may not be as likely to respond, or there are greater risks involved in their potential response to psilocybin. But patients with major depressive disorder overall may respond better to psilocybin than they do to typical first-line treatments. Again, there's just so many questions to answer here.
Yeah, wow. Well, it's an exciting time to be in a field with so many questions to answer because you can be working on answering them all day.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've covered a lot of different ground in this topic of psychedelics. And I wanted to make sure to have, someone who really understands and is in the trenches of how it's being used, how it's effective, when it's not effective, how it compares to psychiatric drugs, because I think there's a general feeling that the tools available right now for treating mental illness or just to improve mental health aren't that effective in a doctor's office. We're seeing there's tremendous connection between diet and mood and the gut microbiome and, these different mental illnesses. So that's always been the part that I've been interested in and covered. And so less so on a actual, medicine. And until I started to learn about psychedelics and this kind of bridge to me between the natural world and the powerful impact I've seen on various chronic diseases and certainly on killing microbial infections of herbs, and how these plants aren't exactly that, but they're kind of in the same field. And so is the brain maybe responding to them better because of this, connection, and from what I've seen, how powerful herbs can be in other capacities. So that was my interest in it. And it sounds like certainly there's a piece of that, but there's just still so much to study that it's hard to say whether that's why they're more effective or why the research is promising at the moment.
An interesting kind of side note to all of that is that we've never used fungal matter in our studies. Every study that we've conducted, I believe almost every study conducted in the world in the modern era, has used pharmaceutical psilocybin or LSD. People can extract psilocybin from fungal matter and then ingest it, but I think almost all of the studies that have been conducted have been on synthesized psilocybin.
Interesting. Oh, okay.
But
and is that because it's just easier to control and measure?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Easier to control and measure, to demonstrate how it was produced and satisfy the FDA in suggesting that it's pure and unadulterated and that we know exactly what it is. That's not to say that, psilocybin doesn't have some kind of natural connection, because obviously it's a naturally occurring compound. It's just, a lot of other questions that we haven't even touched on that the cannabis field is getting into are questions within the realm of entourage, right? Psilocybin containing mushrooms do not only contain psilocybin. There are many other kind of analog-ish compounds like norpsilocybin, psilocin, norpsilocin, baeocystin, norbaeocystin, and other things that exist right along psilocybin in mushrooms that produce psilocybin. And the question is, well, do these things interact? Do they have their own interesting therapeutic effects? And we haven't touched on any of those things in our studies yet. We'll get there maybe.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. It's almost like extracting vitamin C from strawberry without understanding how it interacts with the fiber and all the other components on the human body. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you study that, because I'd love to know what the outcome of that is. Fred, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a very busy man, and there's lots of research to be done and lots of people to treat who are suffering. You guys are making great strides at Hopkins in this field, and I'm very proud to be an alum and to know that this work is going on. So thank you very much again. And, if there's anywhere that people can follow along with the work, will you tell us? Is there some sort of like a newsletter or something like that?
Yeah. Thanks so much for your interest in this, Adrienne, and for inviting me on the podcast. You can follow our work at our website, hopkinspsychedelic.org, all one word. And on that website, you can find a link at hopkinspsychedelic.org/newsletters. You can sign up for our newsletter. They go out often, I think quarterly at this point, where we give updates to our research program, papers we've published, interviews we've done, new studies that are coming online. And you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at JH Psychedelics.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. I look forward to seeing all these exciting developments and helping more people when they feel like they haven't been able to get helped by the things that are available on the market today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's all for today. I hope you found my conversation with Dr. Barrett to be as fascinating and exciting as I did. I can't wait to see what the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research brings to the world with their research and how it will help bring these powerful tools to the marketplace so many more people can access them. To read the written version of this interview, complete with plenty of research links, head to getwellbe.com or check out the link in the show notes. And while you're there, definitely become a Wellbe Insider to get our latest content delivered to your inbox. If you haven't already and found this episode helpful or interesting, click the follow button wherever you listen to podcasts. That way, new episodes will be delivered to you whenever we publish a new one. And please share this episode with family or friends who you think might find it valuable and informative. It means a lot and helps more people find the podcast. And finally, if you love the GetWellbe podcast, please leave me a quick review. Simply scroll to the bottom of our page in your podcast app, and you'll see a place to leave a few stars and a few words. If you already have, then thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is your host, Adrienne Nolan-Smith, and thanks again for listening to the GetWellbe podcast.